For 13 years, Radovan Karadzic, the Serb who ran Bosnia during the Balkan War, was on the lam. On warm days this past summer, he would wander down to his local kafana in Belgrade to eat lunch, sing a few folk songs, and drink slivovitz. But for the last few weeks, Dr. Karadzic has been eating his lunch in a prison in The Hague. Charles Taylor, former president of Liberia and mastermind of the bloodbath in Sierra Leone, is just down the cell block. Perhaps they eat lunch together. Taylor, Karadzic, and a few hundred others are on trial for war crimes, attacks on civilians, genocide, mass deportation, and recruiting child soldiers. The very first war crimes trial began 63 years ago this month in Nuremberg, Germany, when the Allies indicted 22 Nazi leaders. Churchill had wanted to simply shoot them. Stalin favored a show trial and then execution. But the Americans said no. There must be due process and a public record of what had taken place. The first war crimes prosecutor was Robert H. Jackson, a U.S. Supreme Court justice who began his career as a country lawyer in Chautauqua County in upstate New York. Chautauqua is still a bucolic American backwater where people are proud of their native sons and still have time to think. And so a group of local lawyers decided, in the name of Robert Jackson, to get today's international prosecutors, together with the few who remain from Nuremberg, to reaffirm and re-examine the principles of universal criminal justice. Karin Wells decided to be there too. She is no stranger to the subject. Over the years, she has brought us war crime stories from all over Eastern Europe and Africa. Here is her documentary, The Nature of the Charges.
We recently reviewed all 60 hours of the film of the Nuremberg trial, and of the 60 hours, almost 2 hours of that, there's Whitney Harris there with Jackson during the Goering cross-examination. This very handsome guy named Whitney Harris just last week turned 96 years old, and for that I'm going to pause and let's sing Happy Birthday.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. I was in London when Robert Jackson came over, and I was invited to join his staff, so I went to Nuremberg with the first group of American prosecutors, and I stayed throughout the trial. In fact, I was the very last person to leave. I prosecuted. My responsibility was Ernst Kaltenbrunner and the Gestapo and the SD. At the end of World War II, we wanted to establish the responsibility for the commission of the war itself and for the crimes that took place in the course of the war. One of the persons that I was most anxious to find and to interrogate was Rudolf Hirsch. Rudolf Hirsch was a commandant of Auschwitz concentration camp. He'd been hiding out as a farmer. Then spent 3 days talking to Rudolf Hirsch and reducing his testimony to an affidavit in which he told me that they had murdered 2.5 million human beings at Auschwitz. That was the type of evidence that we wanted to produce at Nuremberg, because that would stand in history. And that is why it was very important that we conduct a trial in which the defendants were afforded all of the protections that we afford defendants accused of crime in our own legal systems. We had to prove our case.
There you are.
What do you say, Ben, my little buddy? How you doing?
No need to rise.
This is my young associate. He took off when I dropped out. God, it's good to see you, buddy. You look great. I am so thrilled.
My name is Benjamin Ferencz. I am now in my 89th year. I was the chief prosecutor in one of the subsequent Nuremberg trials that was known as the Einsatzgruppen case.
was not only in the subsequent trial, he was a subsequent trial.
I am still at trial. We charged 22 defendants with murdering over 1 million people in cold blood. Jews primarily, gypsies. All of the 22 defendants were convicted. 13 of them were sentenced to death. I arrested the prosecution's case in 2 days. I was 27 years old, and that was my first case.
Now, I want to tell you the truth. The reason he did that is he took all my evidence. He didn't have to do anything.
That's correct.
The case was proven. I was there in the courtroom when, I don't know whether you
The
know
nature
that.
of the charge.
I have a picture of it. He had interviewed...
The charges we have brought accuse the defendants of having committed crimes against humanity. So here, the killing of defenseless civilians during a war may be a war crime, but the same killings are part of another crime, a graver one, if you will, genocide, or a crime against humanity. This is the distinction.
The trials had many important consequences. One, of course, was to give the victims a feeling that they had not been ignored. But we also were hoping to lay down a precedent for the future, that we would condemn such activities as illegal crimes against humanity, genocide, which I mentioned in my opening paragraphs. So we hope that this would take root. And in fact, it is taking root. We do have international criminal courts today. These are newborn babes, and they still have to be improved, and they're beginning to crawl still. This is the oldest and the youngest. That's good. All right.
They started something at Nuremberg that was possible only through essentially victor's justice. And to me, it represents the heyday of the American vision of justice on the global stage. My name is Mark Drumble. I'm a professor of international law at Washington and Lee University. What must be amazing for these guys in their 80s and 90s is how so late in their lives the seeds that they planted are now blooming in a whole number of international institutions that all refer back to what happened in the late 1940s.
Thank you. How are you? I'm well. Yeah, where have you been? After my talk, so.
8:30 in the morning, and the happy birthday choir from the night before gradually gathers on the sidewalk outside the big old wooden hotel.
How are you?
A little white bus pulls up. We all get on, an ambassador or two, a scattering of academics, and today's prosecutors. Chautauqua is a refuge for thinkers, a place where people have come to talk about the thorny issues and moral dilemmas of modern life for years, and a place that still looks as it did in the 19th century. The bus trundles past old houses with striped awnings, past a town square.
Thanks again.
The public starts to arrive. There's a woman in a green sweater, a refugee from Bosnia, an accountant from Virginia, a local middle-aged couple in matching khaki pants. At the back of the hall, a high school class, kids who weren't even alive for the war in the Balkans, let alone Nuremberg. The chief prosecutors from today's tribunals take their places behind a long table. They are the heirs and successors to the men at Nuremberg.
International criminal justice and what was started at Nuremberg is about a set of ideas, and it's about changing the way people think about the commission of atrocities. Why is it that we easily prosecute somebody for the murder of one human being, but we can leave hundreds of thousands of Sudanese or millions of Jews to suffer their fate? And that the person who ordered those massacres can say, well, I'm a head of state. I get a town car and a flag. And
Layla Sadat is a law professor. She runs the Whitney Harris World Law Institute in St. Louis.
Well, Nuremberg tried to change that idea. Nuremberg stood for the proposition that no one is above the law, and that international law has the right and even the obligation.
Two basic principles: remedy for victims of atrocities and no more impunity for heads of state, at least not for heads of little states.
All right, so the first of these modern war crimes courts is the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And the chief prosecutor, Serge Bramitz, is here. He's sitting on the end. And
Serge Bramitz is a Belgian. He'd never been to the Balkans before he got this job.
Louder.
The tribunal is based in The Hague. It has indicted 161 men and women, Croats, Bosnians, and Serbs. The charges range from maltreatment of civilians to genocide. And they still haven't caught everyone.
For many years, people indicted were fugitives, as for Mladic and Karadzic, which are the most known ones. They have been fugitives for 13 years. So it was a very big moment, big success for the tribunal when Karadzic was arrested. And this was really when I got the phone call by the president of Serbia saying that it's reality. He has been arrested. He's sitting in custody. I was immediately thinking about my first visit to the region. My first visit was to Bosnia, where I met with an organization called the Mothers of Srebrenica.
I had the opportunity to travel on several occasions to the region, to the Balkans and to Bosnia. In Srebrenica, almost 8,000 young men killed only because they were Muslims, and certain villages has to be ethnically cleansed, if I may say. And for these people, and it's so important what is happening, especially the arrest of Radovan Karadzic, because they were for a decade waiting for this day to happen, even if they know that their family members will never come back, but they want to see accountability.
Yes, they do want accountability. 2 years ago, I spent a day with a woman named Bakira driving through Bosnia, looking for a man who had been investigated but never arrested. She was going to find him, she said, take his photograph, give it to the court. Maybe then they would go and get him. And yes, people in Bosnia do think the international community has forgotten them. A man in Srebrenica told me they come, take photographs with their cute little digital cameras, and go. The UN is a joke. He pointed at another man across the cafe. He's one, he said, one of the ones from then, who shot his 3 cousins and his uncle. The tribunals can't prosecute everyone. Even the most sophisticated court systems couldn't handle that many accused. I walked through the cemetery at Potocari with a woman whose son was shot by a Serbian paramilitary group called the Scorpions. They had made a video of themselves unloading their Bosnian captives from a truck, shooting them in the back. She saw that video, saw her son's face, recognized the blue running shoes he was wearing that morning, and watched him die. Her son was 16. We stood at his grave. They caught the Scorpions. 4 were convicted, 1 was acquitted. This summer, 2 of those convicted had their sentences reduced on appeal. Bakira was angry, the young man disgusted, the mother wept. We want justice, they all said. War crimes trials haven't given it to us.
One of the major challenges that the legal community faces is translating that suffering within a framework that is technically organized. And that, of course, is the major challenge of law in all contexts.
As Mark Drumble puts it, truths have to be proven, stories must become evidence. A woman can stand in a cemetery, tell me, this was my son, those were his sneakers. But on cross-examination, that story falls apart. It was dark. Can you see in the dark? Were those sneakers blue or were they dark gray? This was 14 years ago. You don't really know if that was your son.
But, you know, at the end of the day, all you can do in a court of law, take the charges against an accused, prove them beyond a reasonable doubt, and if that is not satisfied, come to an acquittal. But therein lies one of the major problems. We all know Karadzic is at a minimum responsible, and certainly morally guilty, right? As if anyone indicted by an international criminal tribunal is truly innocent. Come on. They're not. But sometimes it can be difficult to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. There's a difference between guilt and responsibility. And that's why when we think about justice and accountability, it is important to think about other mechanisms that tell somewhat different stories in the criminal trial. An approach like a truth commission will tell a different story.
Truth commissions, where stories are told, forgiveness is asked with no threat of charges, public inquiries, it all counts, reparations, money.
And for a lot of victims, that is a very relevant form of justice. A criminal trial doesn't give you that. Different victims want different things. Some victims want to do unto their perpetrator what he did to them.
Eye for an eye.
Right. Other victims simply want to forget and do nothing. There are a lot of victims who just want to move on. And in fact, Spain transitioned from the authoritarian Franco regime, in which crimes against humanity were widespread, without a single trial. And they've done it very successfully. We need multiple forms of justice. We need a toolkit. The public commemoration element is key. It's an under-discussed area of post-conflict justice.
Mark Drumbull and I sat on the veranda of the big old Chautauqua Hotel talking for about an hour.
I mean, more people learned more about Rwanda from that Hollywood film, Hotel Rwanda, than did from the judgments. That is a
Drumbull worked briefly at the Rwanda Tribunal for the defense. He is the only defense lawyer at the conference. 800,000 people were butchered in Rwanda. The tribunal went after thousands of perpetrators initially. Ultimately, only 89 were indicted. It's not that Drumbull has lost faith in international criminal law, but he recognizes its limitations, what it cannot achieve.
The reality is, and we're uncomfortable with it, massive numbers of people contribute. When 800,000 people are butchered in Rwanda, it's not 80-some-odd people who are accused who are the only responsible. A lot of ordinary people who never picked up a machete are themselves participants in this process. And of course, in the Rwandan context, the one entity that I think a lot of Rwandans would like to see held accountable is, of course, the United Nations, who did nothing while the genocide raged. Until a society has a broader conversation about public complicity, true justice will not be activated.
And that can take a couple of generations. Germany only started to have them, the "what did you do in the war, Daddy" conversations, in 1968.
Criminal trials are important. If we box ourselves in to the criminal trial as the be-all and end-all, we're doing a disservice to the diversity of what victims want and what post-conflict societies need.
Cocktail hour chat in the lobby of the hotel. It was Karadic's wife who turned him in when she found out about the mistress. Those men in Cambodia, they're so old they'll all be dead before they go to trial. A former child soldier who now lives in New England signs her book for a law professor. Ben Ferencz's son, someone says, is going to play his bagpipes. Old prosecutors talk to new. Some of today's prosecutors have been working in war crimes for over a decade. Nuremberg was over and done with in 18 months. The Yugoslav Tribunal has gone on for 15 years. The Yugoslav Tribunal has cost $1 billion. That's around $30 million a conviction. At the Rwanda Tribunal, it's more like $60 million. The prosecutors know that is the political reality of how things are measured. No one gives a tribunal $1 billion to acquit the accused.
It was a very good day. We had our own private meeting today, prosecutors.
Where you could say what you felt. They traded frustrations and talked strategy. Stephen Rapp, the chief prosecutor in Sierra Leone, knows they owe a debt to Nuremberg.
I'm a person that studied Nuremberg. I became motivated in part trying to get involved in this whole business because of what they were able to do at Nuremberg. And I think about those cases and the way that they were argued and their importance at the time every day that I go to court.
Back then, at Nuremberg, only Germany was charged with war crimes, only the country that started the war. That meant the Soviet rape and pillage of Eastern Europe didn't count. Neither did Hiroshima. They would both be war crimes today. The body of law has grown. The court in Sierra Leone secured the first convictions in the history of the world for recruiting child soldiers, the first convictions for sexual slavery. 3 heads of government have been prosecuted.
Nobody expected a whole lot out of the Yugoslavia-Rwanda courts initially. Certainly didn't expect indictments of chiefs of state or heads of government. And an enormous momentum has built that's created an expectation that if the head of a movement, the head of a country is involved in a campaign of mass atrocity, that there has to be justice.
These courts are not any longer idealistic dreams for the future, but they're here now, they're proliferating. And that is a very big step in changing the mentality of maybe not every man and woman in the street yet, but changing the mentality of those who wield the reins of power so that perhaps they don't sleep quite as well if they're committing mass atrocities. It points to the fact that people are more sensitive today about the possibility of being prosecuted for real. My name is Don Ferencz. I'm an American attorney, director of a small private foundation, educating to replace the law of force with the force of law. As my father says, the pay isn't very good, but the work is steady.
International criminal courts have proliferated, but the Rwanda, Yugoslav tribunals, the courts in Sierra Leone and Cambodia, they only exist to deal with one war in one region. Now, there is the new permanent International Criminal Court in The Hague. It's been around for 6 years. It has 4 men under arrest from various African conflicts, just 4. It hasn't completed a single trial, and it's hogtied by political realities. 106 countries have ratified the Statute of Rome, the convention that set up the court. The last 2 were Suriname and the Cook Islands. Not exactly heavy hitters. The Arab world doesn't want any part of an international criminal court. Neither does Russia or China or Israel or the United States. The Bush administration didn't just refuse to sign on. It shook its fist at the court.
There is still a provision on the books, the American Service Members Protection Act, which gives the American government the authority to invade The Hague, to use whatever force is necessary in the event that any American should ever be extradited to The Hague. They call it the Hague Invasion Act in Europe, rather mockingly and rather sadly.
Senator Jesse Helms introduced the bill just in time for the American invasion of Iraq. No, Toto, we're not in Nuremberg anymore.
Whitney R. Harris will be our first speaker. This is about Nuremberg, and it's about history, but it's about today, and it's about our posterity. Whitney?
When Whitney Harris and Ben Ferencz and Henry King, the 3 American prosecutors, were in the courtroom in Nuremberg 60 years ago, America was the champion of universal criminal law. We all believe, thou shalt not kill civilians in war, children shall not be turned into soldiers, rape is not an acceptable weapon of war, neither is torture and degradation. Now let us hold each other to it.
Thank you very much, John. My dear colleagues, these guys are my true friends, not only from Nuremberg, from all the years since. I really love them.
The Nuremberg prosecutors, to a man, have argued, lobbied, agitated for the last 50 years against the moral conduct of the United States when it comes to foreign policy, against napalm in Vietnam, carpet bombing of Cambodia, Abu Ghraib. Henry King walked through the ruins of Nuremberg, saw what that tribunal was about, and vowed to dedicate his life to make sure it never happened again. Whitney Harris was there in the courtroom in The Hague when Milosevic was in the dock. Ben Ferencz lobbied for the creation of the International Criminal Court, and at nearly 90, he's still at it.
I work 15 hours a day, average. Nobody pays me. Nobody authorizes me. And what I do is I try to stop war making. There is no such thing as a war without atrocities. And I've been so traumatized by my experience of knowing the mass murderers that the best thing I can do with the rest of my life, and I intend to do, is to try to stop war making. You can't help being traumatized. Talking to the mass murderers, intelligent, educated people, having them try to justify what they did, and it pains me no end to know that I acted in the name of the United States. And now I find the United States government doing things which I would not have tolerated from the Nazis.
There might never be another photograph quite like this. In a few years, the Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunals will be gone, and the Nuremberg prosecutors won't be here forever. Anna Harris shouts at her husband, "Whitney, help Henry!" Henry King's jacket is hanging open, but Whitney doesn't hear. The prosecutor from the newest court, the International Criminal Court, a woman from the Gambia in Africa, looks up and smiles at Anna Harris. Then she leans over and she gently does up Henry King's jacket.
What started at Nuremberg lay fallow for 5 decades. So yes, it's remarkable. It is a wonderfully reaffirming statement on the pendulum and cycle of life. What you've done in your 20s and 30s now comes home in your 80s and 90s.
In Chautauqua, New York, for the Sunday edition, I'm Karin Wells.